Eric Salahub here, and this is a video version of a WebEx that we did earlier in February on backwards design, active learning, and backwards design, and articulating outcomes. And so I'm going to go ahead and hide myself here. Um, so I'm going to be doing the talking today, but I'll just let you know that Carrie Mitchell is the other instructional coach at the Larimer campus, and we've both been working on all of this active learning stuff. So if anything in here piques your interests, please reach out to one of us. You can find us in the Global Address book. We'd love to talk to you about active learning if you want to help with backwards design, outcomes, or anything else. Let's skip this. So as I'm talking, what I would really like you to do is think and write and make connections. It's a little bit of an oxymoron to do a video version of a presentation on active learning. Almost by definition, this is a lecture, and lectures are antithetical to active learning. It's not that lectures have no place at all, but certainly what I'm going to be doing, continuous exposition, talking and talking and talking, doesn't allow much activity, right? So stop and think and write and make connections, and reach out to me. And since this is a video, what you should really do is literally just stop the video and think and jot down ideas, or open up a Word document and write. I'm going to hope to keep this around an hour. But if it takes you 2 hours, that's great, because you'll be doing some work. And again, reach out to me or Carrie or any of the instructional coaches at Front Range Community College if you want to talk more about this. Those are some of my students from a previous semester, and that's what they're doing. They are working in my class. I try to get them to do the work and not do so much of the work myself. So I'm going to show you 2 slides. And each of these slides contains a definition of active learning. I will say a definition of active learning. There is no one definition of active learning. So as you read them, jot down some ideas. This is talking about a chat, because when we did this as a WebEx, there was a chat and we asked people to type into it. But what words or phrases jump out to you? What resonates with you the most about these definitions? Or if you know what active learning is, if you've got some prior knowledge or you want to take a guess, go ahead and think about those ideas too. So this one is from Debbie Morrison. She does a blog called Online Learning Insights, which is pretty awesome. You can check it out. I'm going to read this to you. You can read along. Active learning is a technique, a teaching method that supports learning. This method uses techniques such as writing, reflections, discussion, problem solving, activities that promote analysis, synthesis, and evaluation that guide students toward achieving learning objectives. Active learning aligns with the constructivist perspective of learning. The constructivist view embraces the idea that knowledge is actively constructed by the learner and integrated with his or her existing knowledge and experience. So what jumps out to you about this definition of active learning? And I'm going to assume you're pausing the video if you want to write. So this definition comes from Everett Community College. In the traditional approach to college teaching, most class time is spent with the professor lecturing and the students watching and listening. The students work individually on assignments, and cooperation is limited. Such teacher-centered instructional methods have repeatedly been found inferior to instruction that involves active learning, in which the students solve problems, answer questions, formulate questions of their own, discuss, explain, debate, or brainstorm during class. So how about this one? What is your definition of active learning? You should come up with one. Maybe you want to borrow ideas from those 2 definitions. You could do a Google search and find a whole bunch of other definitions of active learning. Maybe by the end of this little video, we'll say little, into this video, you'll have a sense of what it is. And I think it's worth generating an idea of what it is for yourself. In the Active Learning Institute that we do here at Front Range Community College, we have participants do a little activity where they read those definitions you looked at, they work together in groups, and they end up creating their own definitions. And this is a representative definition that was generated by teachers. Instead of being passive recipients of information, active learning engages students in being equal partners in creating meaning and forces them to acquire knowledge through asking questions, problem solving, collaborative learning, metacognition, reflective self-assessment, and extended applications of knowledge. I like this one. Every group comes up with something slightly different, but I think this captures pretty well what I'm going to be talking about when I say active learning. So I'm not really talking about sprinkles or icing. And I was thinking of different metaphors for this. So we go to a lot of professional development trainings, or we watch videos, and we take away tips and tricks. And, for what they're worth, tips and tricks are great. But a donut with sprinkles is still a donut. It may be a better donut, but it's still a donut. And a cake with icing, to me, is better than a cake without icing, but it's still a cake. I'm not really interested in giving you sprinkles to put on the donut of the class you're already teaching. I want to talk about something much more fundamental, which is a wholesale paradigm shift from the old way of teaching and learning, what I still think is the current paradigm of teaching and learning, to a new paradigm of teaching and learning. And those of you who are scientists or philosophers, or you've probably heard of the idea of a paradigm. It is this all-encompassing way of thinking about something that includes first principles and assumptions, and it all-encompassing really says it. It is super powerful and potent, and I want to talk about it. I'll use the metaphor of the gravitational pull that a paradigm has. It is really difficult to even think about ideas that don't exist within the current paradigm that you're in. And so I think we are still in the knowledge transmission paradigm. We've been there for 500 years. It's the way teaching and learning has typically worked for a long time, at least in academia. We've got teachers, we've got students, we focus on content and facts in general. And most of us have a fairly narrow focus on our own courses, on the prefixes that we teach in, on our departments, the FTE, and the students that are in our courses. And there's much more to this paradigm, but active learning is asking us to shift all of this stuff in a wholesale, significant way to a new way of thinking. Teachers become learner facilitators and course designers. It's a complete identity shift to a new way of thinking about who you are and what your role is. Students have to become learners. They have to take responsibility for their own learning. They cannot expect to be passive recipients of knowledge, because that is not the way this new paradigm works. Content and facts clearly still matter, but the focus is going to shift toward outcomes, competencies, and skills. And it's going to ask us to take a wider view of student success beyond our courses to a student's program, their course of study, their degree, their job, their life. And so this is what I'm talking about, right? Not sprinkles or icing on a cake, but a wholesale change to a new way of thinking about teaching and learning. So there's another way we can look at this, right? So the knowledge transmission paradigm is really focused around courses designed to focus on topics or chapters from a textbook. And in active learning, courses are really designed around outcomes. And in the knowledge transmission paradigm, the instructor's role is to present course content to students. That's what we do as teachers in general in this knowledge transmission paradigm. We are the content experts, the sages on the stage. Our classrooms are designed for us to be at the front with the PowerPoint projector and the whiteboards, and our job is to present the content to students. And the instructor role in the new paradigm is to design lessons that engage students in meaningful ways to help them attain learning outcomes. In this old or current paradigm, the student's main role is to listen to absorb what the instructor presents. And in the active learning paradigm, the student's role is very different, right? They take ownership of these learning outcomes. They know what they are, they know what the goals are for the course, and they actively engage in the course material as a way to meet the objectives. In the current or old paradigm, knowledge is transmitted from teacher to student. That's the main job of the teacher, is to be the content expert and to transmit the knowledge to students by talking, through telling stories, by showing brilliant PowerPoint slides, by working problems on the board. And students, of course, sit there and listen. In this new paradigm, knowledge is learned through actively struggling with complex tasks and problems, right? That's what the student's job is, to struggle with these complex tasks and problems as a way to build knowledge. In this older current paradigm, learning is measured primarily through high-stakes summative assessments. And in general, these are tests that assess how well students can remember the course content. In the new paradigm, learning is measured through both formative and summative assessments, and they're really focused on examining whether students can apply the content, which is critical, as a way to demonstrate the learning outcomes. So, what is learning? And this is where I'm asking you to stop and think. What is learning? If you want to think about what it means in your course for a student to learn, what does it mean? And how would you know if they have accomplished learning the way you're defining it? Oops, sorry about that. So think about something you're good at. And note that you weren't always good at it. How did you become good at it? What was the process that you went through to learn and become good at something that you weren't good at before? And again, I actually want you to think about something that you're good at and to mull over the before and after and the process in between. Well, learning happens in the brain. We've all got one. It's that two-lobed, 3-pound mass of stuff up there in your skull. I've been using the phrase active learning. I could call it brain-based learning because that's what it is. It's focused on the science of learning. And so I want to keep in mind that learning is not this metaphor. I mean, learning is actually a physical process, a literal process that's happening in the brain. So why focus on active learning? Here's a quote from one of my heroes in active learning, Dr. Terry Doyle. He wrote a great book called Learner-Centered Teaching. It's one of the books that got me interested, so much so that after reading it, I convinced Front Range to invite Dr. Doyle to come to a conference we were hosting and do a keynote. Get a hold of his book if you want to learn more about active learning. It's definitely worth checking out. But here's a quote. As professional educators, we have a responsibility to maintain standards of practice, and this includes changing our teaching when the research offers evidence that new practices are warranted. We have an obligation to follow where the research leads. I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of us are not doing this right now. We're teaching based on the ways that we were taught, or anecdotes, or what we think works, which may or may not be true. And we're probably teaching very similar to the ways that people have been teaching in classrooms for the last 500 years. I think most of us are probably extremely happy that our doctors and dentists are following the research. Well, there's a lot of research in how learning happens and the sorts of techniques for teaching and learning that are effective. And I am going to agree with Dr. Doyle here that we are obligated as professionals to follow the research. The research on active learning, I think, is extremely powerful. Active learning is more effective than the old or current paradigm. And don't trust me, be skeptical. But I looked at 2 big meta-analyses done in the last, 10, 12 years. And both of these meta-analyses of hundreds of studies indicate that active learning works. There is evidence that active learning works. It works better than more passive approaches, and the multiplicity of sources makes this argument compelling, and that's from the Michaels meta-analysis. And the Prince meta-analyses said something pretty similar. Active learning works. All forms of active learning works. A lot of it's not controversial, but the magnitude of the improvements shown in active learning came as a surprise. The research says active learning works. My own experiences and the experiences of my colleagues here at Front Range Community College tell me that active learning works. I want you to be skeptical. I'm not an authority, and even if I was, you shouldn't trust me. Here's how you should find out. You should take the risk and do it and see your students learn more or not. And it's going to take more than sprinkles and icing, but I'm going to encourage you to jump from one paradigm to the other and redesign your classes and become an active learning facilitator and actually see it happen in your classes. This is, what I know about teachers is they want to see it happen with their students. So what's in a name? Again, we could call it active learning. That's the phrase I use. We could talk about evidence-based teaching. You may have heard of a flipped classroom or student-centered teaching or standards-based teaching. I'm going to use active learning. Not that I branded that, but I think it has a meaning to me that some of these other phrases maybe don't do. But I'm going to talk about active learning, but if you see any of these other phrases somewhere, it's likely that that person or that book is talking about something similar to what I'm going to be talking about today. Well, this is how I got started in this. My best class ever. I have been teaching for more than 25 years in higher ed. At Front Range Community College, I had been teaching in learning communities with a colleague, Carrie Mitchell, for more than 10 years. And learning communities at Front Range mean we take 2 courses. In my case, ethics or introduction to philosophy, and Carrie's an English teacher. So we've been mashing up philosophy and English courses, integrating them into consistent integrated learning experiences for students. We take 2 3-credit classes and we create a 6-credit class. And we co-teach those classes. And we did it in face-to-face environments for 5 years. And those were the best classes we ever taught. And then we decided to take our learning community online. We had both been teaching online for a long time. I've been teaching online for, since 1994. And that was a challenge for us because even in the face-to-face environment, we still had the ethics classroom and the English classroom. And we did some co-teaching, but we still had separate grade books and separate assignments. And we had some overlap in themes, but we were still kind of teaching 2 parallel and halfway overlapped courses. But when we decided to take our learning community online, we decided to go all in. And we designed it in one LMS site, right? We used Desire to Learn. So we built one course site with one set of assignments and one grade book. And we had to agree on everything because we wanted a course without English assignments or ethics assignments. We wanted one course that totally integrated everything into one holistic experience for students. And that was really hard. We had to debate and argue literally for 2 months over a summer. We had to talk about our outcomes in a way that we had never talked about outcomes before. And we're both people that are on the Student Learning Committee, right? Our assessment committee, who talk about outcomes all the time. But we had to own those outcomes and really talk about how do we design assignments that include the outcomes for both of our classes. And it ended up as this course. We actually started it in 2014, I think, but this is just a screenshot from 2015. It was the best class ever. And what we mean by that is the students learned more. They outperformed any students we had ever had. They wrote better papers. They learned more about ethics. They had more fun. And man, we had so much fun. It was really fun reading awesome papers, I got to tell you, and giving feedback to students that cared about the class. And it wasn't a fluke because semester after semester, our online students in this class were just doing awesome work. And we had to pause and step back and say, what's going on here? And we thought we had discovered something or invented something. And so we wrote an internal grant here at Front Range and did some research and found out that we had not discovered anything. I mean, we kind of had, but we had not invented anything. We had stumbled on active learning, something that's been around at least since the 50s with research going back that far or farther. And this led us to do more research and to create the Active Learning Institute, and that's led me to be here today talking to you. I know this stuff works because it worked in my class and my students did better. And that was super gratifying. One of the hard things about putting together this presentation is there's just so much to talk about. It's an entire paradigm of teaching and learning, and I have, an hour. I thought this was a Socrates quote, but I could not find a reference from Socrates or Plato. So whatever, I'm a philosopher. I'll put Socrates up there. To know anything, you must know everything. I cannot talk about everything today. So there's going to be some missing pieces, and I hope you come back, next week and talk about part 2 or watch the video for part 2. I'm going to give you part of it today, and I'm going to leave threads hanging and dangling and teasers about things, and follow up with me if you want more. But it was definitely a dilemma, and it's probably I'm talking fast. Well, here's my mentor, who I've only met once. I've emailed back and forth with him a few times. Dr. Terry Doyle, developmental English teacher. I think he's retired now. Author of Learner-Centered Teaching. And if you're going to remember one thing, if you want a tip or some sprinkles that really matter, it's this quote: "The person who does the work does the learning." That's what learning is. It's doing the work. And if you want to talk about backwards design, which we will in the next 40 minutes, design your class so the students do the work, so you can watch them doing the work, and so you can assess the work in progress. The Active Learning Institute, right? I mean, this is one of the problems I have in talking about this for an hour is here at Front Range, we offer, Carrie and I developed the Active Learning Institute, and it has, more than 30 hours of material that we help teachers work through over the course of an entire semester. So I only have an hour to get you interested in this stuff and let you take away something meaningful. And then after they take a semester to learn the theory of active learning, they do a course redesign, where they start from scratch and redesign a course using backwards design methods that we're going to talk about today. And they totally redesign a class from the ground up, and they articulate every single thing in the class, and then they teach that class, and then they have ongoing mentoring. And so there's clearly more to active learning than I can hope to talk about today. And this is not to talk about how awesome I am or how awesome Carrie is in designing this. We designed an institute that forced our college to do the work, and these are some of the reflections they have about how powerful this transformation is from the old paradigm or the current paradigm to the new paradigm. It is super valuable to my colleagues, and that is why I put together this presentation for you today. Well, we're here today to really focus on the cornerstone, the keystone to active learning, which is backwards design. You can call it standards-based design or outcome-based design, but it's backwards design. And I'm a metaphor person, so let me give you one. When I was a kid, I loved setting up dominoes and watching them fall. And I always started where I wanted the domino to end, and I designed backwards. So every single domino was in place, so when I tipped over that first domino, everything was in place, nothing extraneous, everything was intentional, so my little patterns would work out and my dominoes would fall the way I wanted them to. That's what you want to do when you design an active learning class. I did not invent this, although I had never heard of Wiggins and McTighe. I was talking about backwards design simply because it made sense to me, but one of my colleagues here at Front Range, Allison Thilke, told me, well, there are two professors, Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, who have written a book on backwards design. It's called Understanding by Design. I have not read this book yet, but I do have it ordered. I just want to let you know there are a lot of other people talking about backwards design, and these are experts. There's tons of YouTube videos that they've presented. They teach at, or did teach at, prominent universities, and I'll mention them again. So I want to give credit where credit is due. I'm not an authority on this. I'm not sure if they would call themselves authorities, but there's a lot of stuff out there, and you might want to check out their book. So I want you to recall. It was only 20 minutes ago, but I asked you to think about the role of the teacher in the current or old paradigm and the new paradigm. In the knowledge transmission paradigm, it's about presenting content. In the active learning paradigm, it's about what? Designing courses. And that's what backwards design is all about, right? It is about backwards design. And it is a skill most of us did not learn, right? We became teachers because we're content experts. Maybe some of you out there are instructional designers, and you probably know a lot about this already. But most of us did not become teachers because we went through instructional design. We design our courses, but not based on any particular theory. So what are the basics of backwards design? This is kind of the way Wiggins and McTighe talk about it, and I think it makes a lot of sense. There are 3 steps. Define your outcomes, decide how students will demonstrate proficiency or mastery in those outcomes. McTighe and Wiggins talk about what kinds of evidence are students going to have to produce so you will know how effectively they have met those outcomes. And then design the day-to-day lesson plans. And we're really only going to get to talk about step 1 today. And if you want to come back next week or watch the video for part 2, you can hear me talk about parts 2 and parts 3. But you can't do part 2 and part 3 unless you actually think about the outcomes for your class. What are those outcomes? And how can we unpack them into their cognitive tasks so we can actually decide what our class should focus on? So recall that in the current or old paradigm, courses are designed around topics or chapters. Typically, you get a textbook and you design your class around the topics or content, and the textbook is kind of that hallmark of the content, right? Where's the content? It's the stuff that's in the textbook. The active learning paradigm and backwards design is going to be doing something quite different. So what are we comparing to? So most of us probably aren't doing backwards design. You may be doing one of these sorts of things. Forward design, I think that's what Wiggins and McTighe call it. Topic-based or content-based design, or maybe you're just winging it. Forward design, I think this is typically how that works. You decide which topics and content to cover, and then you design day-to-day lesson plans and assign homework. And what you probably do, or often what we do, is we open a textbook, and that's the topics and content, and we build our day-to-day lesson plans chronologically around the chapters and subunits of a textbook. And then we design midterms or final exams to test how well students understand or learned. That's what I'm going to call forwards design. Many of us are doing this. Topic-based design or content-based design probably looks a lot like this. This is a snippet from an anatomy and physiology textbook. And what do? Well, you know, I need so many days on part 1, so many days on part 2, and then I'm going to give a midterm, and then I'm going to need a couple of weeks to do parts 3 and parts 4, and then I'm going to give you a midterm number 2, and then I'm going to start running out of time, so I'm going to speed up and then give a final exam, right? I mean, something like that is often how we design our classes. There are problems. And if you want to have fun, go on the internet and do a Google search for poor design or bad design, and you'll see all kinds of humorous pictures, which I think illustrate some of the problems with content-based or topic-based design. I'm sorry, there's an error in the slide that I'll need to fix. It should say content-based design and topic-based design, but they're really the same thing, so maybe it's not an error. Well, in this picture, all the content is there, but I'm not sure the person was thinking about the person who needed to use the content or what the purpose of the content was for. Well, let's go back to backwards design. We need to design our outcome, right? What is the point of the class? Again, I'm not saying content or topics aren't important, but we don't want to start there. We want to start with the outcomes. What are the goals of the class? What are the learning outcomes that students should gain in the class? What are they? What are the learning outcomes for your class? And I want you to pause and actually think about it for a minute. What are the learning outcomes for your class? And one way to think about it, I'm going to challenge you, is to imagine an elevator pitch. What if a student grabbed you in the hallway, or you're in the elevator together and you got 30 seconds, and the student says, I'm thinking about taking your class, professor. What will they learn? What skills or abilities will I gain? How will I be different next semester compared to who I am now? What will I be able to do after the class that I can't do now? And, the elevator floors are ticking away. What are you going to tell this student? How are you going to synopsize your class in that elevator pitch? Which is probably an unfair question, but I'm actually asking you to try. What if you had to summarize it in one sentence? What's the main reason to take your class? How is she going to be different? Again, this is unfair, but here are some sample elevator pitches. This is probably what I would tell students in my 100 level philosophy classes. After this class, you're going to be able to entertain ideas you don't believe. One of my colleagues in a math who's teaching math said, after this semester, you're going to be able to solve real world math word problems. Or one of my biology colleagues said, you're going to be able to draw correct conclusions from scientific infographics. Or you're going to be able to diagnose or fix a transmission problem. There's not one outcome, and then this is really just a way to get you to think about what outcomes are. But I actually do think that thinking about an elevator pitch is a very potent way to think about the most important outcome of your class, or how you would boil those things down. Well, what are outcomes? They're action words. And you've probably heard of Bloom. Let me move this. Benjamin Bloom and Bloom's taxonomy, and we've got this hierarchy. Maybe it's a hierarchy of, the kinds of things students should be able to do. And note that they are action words. Students should be able to recall or define or duplicate or classify or explain or locate or demonstrate or solve or question or organize or compare and contrast or judge or select or develop or formulate or assemble or design. Just as a side note, Bloom did not just create this taxonomy. Benjamin Bloom was one of the initial researchers in memory and learning, and in fact, he was studying and critiquing the importance or power of lectures way back in the 1950s. So, definitely check more out. Bloom is famous for this, but he did a lot of other things too. But what about outcomes that say students will learn, or students will understand, or students will be exposed to, or students will appreciate? I'm going to call those weasel words as a logician and someone who teaches critical thinking and rhetoric. You're letting yourself and your students off the hook. What does learning mean? And what does understanding mean? And how will you know they can do it? What's the evidence that students understand or learn? Or how will you know if they can actually appreciate something? And I don't even know what being exposed to means. I will let you go there. But I've seen that outcome written. Students will be exposed to the 12 major schools of philosophy. We'll think about learning outcomes and content. Both are important. But I think the knowledge transmission paradigm focuses much more on content and topics, and the active learning paradigm is much more about focusing on outcomes. But I want to ask you, what is the relationship between content and outcomes in your course? And pause and mull that over for a minute. You've got both of them in your course. What's the connection or relationship between them? And before I confuse anybody, I'm using the term outcome, but there are similar terms like goals, objectives, and competencies, and there are more. And depending on who you are, each of these words might have a particular meaning that differentiates them from one another. I'm going to use the word outcome for all of them. They're all outcomes. So I'm going to use the word outcome as kind of this all-encompassing phrase to talk about the skills or abilities that students gain in a class. There are criticisms of learning outcomes, and I wanted to acknowledge those. I have done a lot of research. I've read a ton about people pushing back about learning outcomes, and so I just wanted to summarize a few of the most powerful and common criticisms that teachers raise against learning outcomes. And maybe these are criticisms that you have or your colleagues have. Outcomes commercialize education. They turn students into widgets. They commodify everything and they commercialize, and it's about capitalism, and it's about, I don't know, shortchanging the real power of education. Outcomes can't capture the real importance of my classes. I actually hear this one a lot. I have outcomes, but I can't write them down, right? Because the real importance of my classes are just things you can't capture in an action phrase. I don't buy it. I'll just tell you flat out, I don't buy it. That's the person saying, I know it when it happens. It's not enough. It's not enough. If it matters, figure out a way to know it, to measure it and to tell students how they're going to know if it happens too. Outcomes infringe on academic freedom. I don't see it, but that's a common refrain. My class is mine and I can teach it however I want. I'm not telling you how to teach your class. I am just suggesting that if you actually know the end goal or the goals that you want students to attain, you might be able to apply your academic freedom more productively. Outcomes limit creativity and the ability to be a dynamic teacher. Again, I don't see it that way at all. However, I will say that if you teach at a school that has very rigid outcomes, maybe you want to push back on those. Outcomes should not be laundry lists of specific things, at least in my opinion. I only want you to articulate the outcomes that you care about. Outcomes are not about the professor. I underline this one because it's true. These are student learning outcomes and they're not about you. This criticism really harkens to the old or current paradigm of knowledge transmission, because a professor or a teacher who says this is clearly suggesting that the class is about me, and that you should judge the quality of the class by judging my performance about what I do in the classroom. Learning outcomes are about what the professor helps students achieve. And so I underline this one because I think it really helps highlight the difference between the current or old paradigm and the new paradigm. Professors are super important in the new paradigm, but they're important for what they help students attain. And you, I'm going to argue, should judge the quality of a teacher in the new paradigm based on the learning that students accomplish. If you want some resources, I'm happy to send you this document. Just do a Google search on criticisms of learning objectives and you'll find all kinds of stuff. So there's a whole bunch of different learning outcomes that are relevant to your class and to backwards design. There are probably college level learning outcomes, program level outcomes. We're going to focus mainly on course level outcomes today. And if you come back for part 2 next week, or if you watch the video, we'll focus more on unit and assignment level. But there are all kinds of outcomes, and backwards design would be relevant or should be relevant to all of them. And again, if you're going to be writing outcomes or rewriting outcomes, or if the outcomes you have aren't already written this way, translate them into language that focuses on what students will be able to do. What are they? And I will send you a document if you want, or certainly create your own. What are the course level outcomes? Articulate them. Here at Front Range Community College, our state community college system does this for us because there are state mandated learning outcomes for every course. And ours are faculty driven. We get together every year and we talk about these kinds of things, and we can edit them, but they often stay the way they are forever. The ones for my classes have been the way they are for more than 20 years. I've been teaching here for 20 years, and the outcomes for most of my classes have never changed. If you can make up your own, fine, do that. But what are the outcomes for your class? What should students be able to do when they leave your class? And are there college-wide outcomes? At Front Range, we call them SLOs, student learning outcomes. Those big picture outcomes that we think every student should get by the time they graduate. Maybe your school has them. If you're teaching at Front Range, we've got them. There are things like effective communication, critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, information and technology literacy, professionalism. Most schools have them. And I'm asking you to articulate the ones that matter for your class. And maybe your school tells you which ones matter. Or, your department tells you that your course should attend to effective communication written and quantitative reasoning and professionalism. But I'm asking you, before you start your backwards design process, to actually articulate these college-wide outcomes that matter, that you've decided matter for your class. Write them down. And then think about your own outcomes. You may have goals for your students that aren't mandated by the state, and they're not mandated by the college. They go beyond the content or the focus of your course. They're things that you happen to care about as a teacher. And if you're not sure what you value as a teacher, you should go and take this teaching goals inventory. And you can find it easily by Google searching teaching goals inventory, and the first thing that'll come up is this link from Iowa. I think it's from Iowa State. And it takes about 15 minutes. It's going to look something like this, where you're going to do a Likert scale and just talk about what you value. And then when you hit, send at the end, it's going to collate everything you said, and it's going to spit back out your values based on what you said. And what I love about this online version, it's also going to say, if you type in your discipline or the courses you teach, it's going to tell you, how does what you say you care about match up with other people who teach similar classes? The reason this is important is everything you care about, every outcome that matters for your course, needs to be on a piece of paper before you start your backwards design process. Because if you don't articulate it, you won't be able to build it into your course. And so write it down. And there may be other levels of outcomes that you want to write down. You may have program level outcomes or other things. And so I just, this list could be longer. It could have more elements to it. I don't know everything that you teach or the programs you teach in. My point is, every outcome that matters should be written down and articulated in a way that makes sense to you. If you were in the Active Learning Institute, what I would do is say, okay, now take 20 minutes and actually think about all those outcomes and all those lists that you just wrote and talk about how they overlap. How do they intersect? My guess is there's an intersection between the university or college level outcomes and the ones for your course. As someone who teaches philosophy, well, guess what? Critical thinking is a key college level outcome, and it is a crucial course level outcome in every philosophy class. How do the outcomes that you've articulated complement one another? Where are the overlaps? How do they complement? Where's the synergy between them? Maybe you want to write about it. Maybe you want to create a concept map. Maybe you want to do some Venn diagrams. This is something that's going to take more than 2 minutes. So you don't have time to do it now, but after you finish this webinar, think about it and actually take the time to do this. This is not the articulating of the outcomes, this is the owning of them, right? This is making them authentic in a way that matters to you, because if you don't own these outcomes, then you won't be able to design a course that actually incorporates them in a meaningful way. And I'm just going to tell you, since I'm not your dean or department chair, if there are outcomes that are on that list that you really don't care about, then don't include them in your concept map. Now I'm going to ask you, if you're willing, to rewrite those outcomes. Consolidate them into one list and overlap them and synergize them, and there'll probably be fewer outcomes on this list than that laundry list of different outcomes that you just thought about. Maybe there are some that don't appear at all because they're consolidated and incorporated, or you don't really think they matter. But do your best. This is a sample from a colleague who teaches at Larimer campus, Front Range Community College, and she went through all of hers, the state mandated ones, the college mandated ones, her own values, and she came up with these. So these were the statewide ones. These were the 2 college-wide outcomes that she thought were the most important: critical thinking and effective communication. And these were her own personal outcomes that she really valued. And this is what she came up with when she articulated them in her own authentic voice. 4 outcomes: communicate effectively, apply and connect, reason through, evaluate judiciously, and this is the way she describes them in her syllabus to students. And this colleague has actually done a backwards design focused on these outcomes and curriculum mapped them to every single assignment in the class. So she knows that her students are actually getting to practice all of these outcomes multiple times. And so this is what I'm asking you to do. Are you up for that challenge? I think you are. I think you're up for it. I think you should do that, or reach out to an instructional coach, and we'll help you do it. So let's go back. I asked you, 15 minutes ago, to think about the connection between content and outcomes in your course. And if you want to, you could, actually write a line down the middle of a piece of paper, list the content, the facts, the topics on one side, list the outcomes on the other. Well, we've just spent some time. Now you know what your outcomes are. You already knew what the content was, right? That's the stuff that's on your PowerPoint slides and in your textbook. What's the relationship between these 2 things? I'm going to offer a suggestion. Is the content the means and the outcome the end? I know I'll get pushback on this, so I'm going to drive on, but I want you to think about this. In active learning, it is likely the case that the content is critically important, but it is not intrinsically valuable, right? It is there and super important, but what really matters is not this kind of acquisition of content, whatever that means, but what students can do with the content. My most important outcome is critical thinking. Well, you can't think about nothing. If you're in a philosophy class, I'm going to be asking you to think critically about ethical theories or philosophical theories, source material, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I do not think the content of a philosophy class is intrinsically valuable. I don't even honestly know, and I'm a philosopher, I think a lot about value and intrinsic value. What does it even mean to say the content is intrinsically valuable? I think it's extrinsically valuable, right? What does a student do with that content? Maybe there's some other kind of relationship. The content and the outcomes are interconnected in some way. And in fact, a colleague who went through the Active Learning Institute suggested this. Yes, he agreed with me, Eric. The content and topics are a means to the end of students gaining important outcomes like critical thinking. But this is what happens in an active learning class, right? He told me something that I had never thought about before. Once students become better critical thinkers, they're actually then able to access the content and topics in a better way. And once they're critical thinkers, they can access that content and topics and learn it and know it better, which then actually feeds back into the outcome. So he suggested that the relationship is this feedback loop. I will say, though, that keep in mind that ultimately the content and the topics are there because they drive learning or they're relevant within the context of learning. I wanted to give you a few examples if you want to think about how this might work. This is a philosophy class, so we've got philosophy content, and then we've got some philosophy outcomes. And so I want my students to do reading from Plato and Descartes and Dan Dennett and watch these videos so that they can attain these outcomes like identify and distinguish the schools of philosophy and evaluate primary sources and read and analyze and apply. And they need this in order to do this, but as they're better able to do these things, then clearly they're better able to actually access and think about the content. This is an ethics example because I mainly teach ethics. A whole bunch of ethical theories, which I've just said aren't intrinsically valuable, but students need the theories in order to evaluate and analyze them and to figure out how to actually lead a better life. That's ultimately what I want students to do, right, with ethics, is evaluate and analyze these theories. And so they can actually develop these principles to leave my class able to lead a better life. Here's an example from economics. Well, we've got the content and topics, right? Labor markets and globalization and international trade. But when I talk to my economics colleagues, what do they actually care about? They want students to evaluate macroeconomic public policy or predict economic outcomes or compare fiscal and monetary policies. The content is important, but it's not an end in itself. It's there so students can actually do something with it. If you're a writing teacher, this might look familiar. Here are the topics or some topics from a writing class. But why do these matter? Drafting and editing in and of themselves are not intrinsically valuable. They're valuable because they actually help a student write a paper. I think this is from an EMS class. These are the topics from the chapters of the textbook. But probably what my EMS colleagues really want students to do is to manage a student's airways or perform effective patient assessments, right, using evidence-based thinking. These are the outcomes of the class. If you teach geology, well, you might see these kinds of topics. Streams is a topic, and metamorphic and igneous rocks and deserts and winds. But look at the outcome. Why do we need to know about rocks and earthquakes and glaciers? So we can actually discuss the mechanisms that contribute to landscape evolution, right? Those sorts of things. Anatomy and physiology. Well, we've got cell structure and the skeletal system and the nervous system and the lymphatic system. Those are the topics and content and facts. But why do students need to care about those things? So that they can actually use that knowledge to describe the features of anatomical structures. I'm just thinking, since we have one, so when students go to the cadaver lab and do dissections, they can actually describe what's going on. Or if they're working and looking at a real human being, they can describe the anatomical structures. And they can explain the interrelationships. I think what's really interesting is The textbook is oriented by content and topics, but that is not how human bodies are designed. Some of our anatomy and physiology colleagues here at Larimer, or excuse me, at Front Range Community College, when they went through the Active Learning Institute, what they realized is they need to throw away their textbook, or if they can't do that, they at least need to realize that they're going to integrate these chapters, and instead of studying bones for 2 weeks and then muscles for 2 more weeks and then tendons for 2 more weeks, they're going to study the knee, and then they're going to study, I don't know, the hip and the elbow, because ultimately the goal was to talk about how these systems work together. And so getting hung up on designing your class around topics and content may lose sight of why that matters. Well, you've seen these probably, right? Russian nesting dolls. There are a lot of things that we as content experts and professionals have automized, and this is a dictionary definition of what that means. It's practicing a skill so much that it becomes virtually routine. And the example here is hitting a golf ball, which I would not use because I'm not a golfer. But if you wanted to zoom out a little bit and think about backwards design, you might do something like this, right? This is kind of a typical backwards design in maybe a second semester college level writing class. Ultimately, students are going to have to write a research paper at the end. That's where they get to showcase all the skills that they've learned. The elevator pitch is probably, once you finish this class, you're going to actually be able to write an academic research paper. And then this person sat down and actually did some backwards design. What are they going to have to do in order to meet this outcome? Well, they're going to have to be able to do these things first, right? They're going to have to be able to do summary and response, and then they're going to have to understand about citations and bibliographies. And then, well, if they're going to be expected to do summary response, they're going to have to practice it. And you can see how this person's already working back to thinking about what are they going to be doing for homework and what are they going to be doing in class. So I want to tell them they're going to have to practice with summary. So practicing with summary is an outcome that I need to build into my backwards design. But the professor of that class has probably automized that. For us, summarizing an article is an automized task like hitting a golf ball is for a golfer. But think about your students. For many of them, that is an outcome that has a whole bunch of sub-skills. I'm going to call them cognitive skills. And we need to peel those things apart as part of our backwards design and realize that in order to summarize an article, students have to have a whole bunch of other skills first. Understanding vocabulary, identifying main points, brainstorming, paraphrasing, grammar, a whole bunch of other stuff too. Even these are composite skills that you would want to think about when you design your class. Now, you can't backwards design into infinity, but it is definitely worth thinking about these Russian nesting dolls. That's my metaphor. And when you're designing your class, how do you peel apart enough of the outcomes to actually let students practice sufficiently to be able to meet the outcomes? And if you come back next week or watch part 2 of the video about formative and summative assessments, we'll talk much more about that. So I don't have time to have you do this now, but write down one of the outcomes for your class, maybe even one of the basic ones, and then step back and try to put yourself in the head of a novice, a non-golfer, and think about the cognitive skills that students will need in order to be able to do that. Or if you have trouble with it, write down your outcome and find a smart colleague from another discipline and have them do this for you. So what are the levels of backwards design? Course level, we focus mostly on that. If I could rule the world, I would make sure colleges and programs were backwards designing and incorporating the course level backwards design in this overall design so students actually have this kind of seamless experience where everything is there and everything's there for a reason and intentional. And there may be colleges that do that. I haven't seen one. So, I don't know, we've had a crash course here on outcomes and content. Now what? Well, we've focused on defining and articulating learning outcomes. We've talked about what they are, what outcomes are. We've talked a little bit about content versus outcomes, and I don't want to use that phrase, content plus outcomes, and how the content of the class and the outcomes of the class work together to facilitate or foster learning. And we've talked a little bit about unpacking outcomes and unstacking the nesting dolls. If you come back next week or watch part 2, we'll talk about steps 2 and 3. But as a teaser, I want to ask you this. What if you had to create one summative assessment that would allow students to showcase everything they've learned? I'll just tell you right now, I'm not sure that's the best way to go. And if you come back next week, I'll tell you why. But it's a great way to think about your overall ultimate outcomes. That one summative assessment can probably not ask a student to do everything, but what could you design? And I'm going to suggest this. Throw out what you're currently doing for now. Whether it's a midterm, or a final project or a paper, what could it be? Not something that tests students on the content. I mean, the content matters. But what could you do that would let students showcase what they've learned? The skills they now have, the abilities they now have, and how would you be able to look at that and actually say, yes, you're proficient in the outcomes, or you've actually mastered the outcomes, or you're still developing, you're not there yet. I mean, what would you create that would let students showcase that, provide that evidence so you could look and see? And maybe you want to go back to your elevator pitch. How would you know at the end? What would you design to let students showcase that person that they are at the end of the course, what they've become, the different person they are because they now have skills and abilities that they didn't have? It's probably not a research paper because I want you to think outside the box, but what could it be? And if you want a template, there's tons of templates for backwards design. If you just do a Google search for backwards design templates, you will find dozens, scores, hundreds of them. I think this is one from McTighe, of Wiggins and McTighe. You can see it's got 3 parts. And this actually comes from Vanderbilt University's Teaching Center. So you can certainly check this out. It's asking you to think about what are the desired results, the outcomes, what do you want students to understand, what's the evidence going to be, and then what's your learning plan. I won't say this isn't rocket science. I'm not saying it's insignificant, but I don't have a favorite backwards design template. I think, but this is a good one. So it's worth checking out. If you want a template, this is a great place to start. If that one doesn't do it for you, I also thought this one from Chatham University was pretty cool. And so I'm certainly happy to, if you just do a Google search for Chatham University backwards design, you'll find this. Look, guess what? It's pretty darn similar, right? My desired result is that learners can do what? And again, I don't like this phrase, but I would make it more specific. What evidence are you going to need? And then how do you design the activities? And just note, all we've talked about so far is this, and I'm teasing you with this part. And if you come back next week, we'll talk about these parts. But that's it. So I'm going to close out this and just encourage you to reach out to me, Eric Salahub, or Carrie Mitchell if you want to talk more about this. Thank you for listening and thinking.